G'day everyone. My name is Michael Chato. I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund, and I'm really grateful for you all tuning in to hear this important conversation with Lee Caspi, Director of Resource Development at Physicians for Human Rights in Israel. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Lee's joining us from Jaffa, where she works to support doctors and medical professionals, volunteering their time to provide medical care to those who are otherwise unable to receive treatment, and to support the organization's efforts to promote equal access to healthcare for all. When Lee and I met at the PHRI clinic in Jaffa in September of this year, she told me about the enormous challenge of working to provide medical treatment to refugees, Palestinians, and to others who are otherwise unable to receive treatment through Israel's medical system. The challenges sounded truly immense at the time, but they pale in comparison to the daily reality that she and her colleagues are operating under since the horrific and senseless violence of October 7th and the subsequent war in Gaza. That work is made possible by the incredible generosity of donors like so many of you watching this video. And so I want to begin by saying thank you to you. If you haven't yet made a contribution, or you have, but you'd like to again, you can do so by heading to nif.org.au and clicking the purple Donate Now button. Every dollar truly makes a difference and will go towards supporting our amazing grantees like PHRI, who are on the front lines responding to this urgent crisis today. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest, Lee Caspi, Director of Resource Development at PHRI. Lee has been working in human rights for nearly a decade and has an LLM in human rights law from the University of Edinburgh. Prior to her work at PHRI, Lee worked at Hamoked, an organization providing legal aid to Palestinians, and as a research intern at Amnesty International. Lee, thanks so much for being with us. How are you doing? How are you coping?
Thanks for having me, and thank you for the support. We really appreciate all these really heartfelt, warm messages of financial and ideological support during these incredibly difficult times. I'm okay. I think nobody here can give a better answer than that at the moment. We're all sad and heartbroken and carrying this along with us during our days. I think when you work in an organization that is also constantly responding to the unfolding emergency situation, it's also hard to find moments to disconnect yourself. I think if I were working as a teacher or in high tech, I would maybe not be in such a loop of constantly consuming all the sad material coming out of the war. It's hard to disconnect because of what I do, but I'm trying to, find moments to go to the gym and watch silly things in the evening and clear my head a little.
Well, I'm glad you're finding that time, and I can only imagine how tough it is right now to do that. But yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that work that you've described. PHRI is doing such amazing work. So can you tell us a little bit about what your focus has been since October the 7th?
Yeah, I think very early on when the kind of reality of the Hamas attack on Israel's southern communities began to reveal itself, it was clear to us that we had to respond both on a statement level and in terms of offering support to anybody who needed it and was unable to receive it through the normal Israeli Ministry of Health institutions. So from the very beginning, we've been part of the conversation here about the situation that's happening. And more importantly, we very quickly began receiving requests for direct medical support from Israeli citizens who were evacuated from the south. And I'm sure we'll delve more into that a little later in our conversation. But for us, this was a big shift in a new focus area because we normally provide services for, sorry for the ambulance in the background. We normally focus on communities that are not entitled to these Israeli public services, and having to provide direct medical care to Israelis was new, but also important for us. And I think all of us felt like we had to do something to try and help the survivors of that violence. So our focus for the first 2 or 3 weeks, I would say, was much more weighted towards people who survived the Hamas massacre, both Israelis and others, as I'm sure we'll touch on soon. And as time has gone by and as the Ministry of Health has stepped in to offer the support that people need, our focus, and as the situation in Gaza and the West Bank, by the way, has deteriorated and worsened, our focus has also shifted to those areas that are in need of support that is beyond imagination, like honestly boggles the mind, the dire need for humanitarian aid there. And yeah, I've seen this sort of shift also in what we're talking about and what we're looking at and the newsletters we're writing. And our work always combines direct medical assistance and policy change work. So I've seen that shift also happen in our policy focus areas.
That's amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you for all of that incredible work. I'd love to talk a little bit about the policy work. But first, I just want to hear a little bit more. Tell us about the communities, specifically in Kibbutz PHRI and the surrounding area. You talk about that kind of being the focus in your early days after October 7th. What were the gaps that existed in the response of the government that civil society needed to fulfill at that time?
So I think it was as early as October 8th, but it may have been October 9th that we received, we were contacted by the nurse of the community formerly known as Kibbutz PHRI. I don't really know how else to refer to it because it's been so devastated by this attack. And she and her and all other survivors who didn't need to be hospitalized were evacuated to a hotel in the Dead Sea where they were all staying together. She reached out to say, I'm trying to provide health care to my community. There's no Ministry of Health support set up here yet. And there are people with minor injuries. There are people struggling with enormous anxiety, unable to sleep, people with chronic care needs that don't have a nearby pharmacy where they can buy the medication that they need to take. They weren't able to take anything from their homes. So she just asked us to come and help with all of that. And that same day, we sent down like a small first delegation, which included a GP, a nurse, and 2 of our staff members. On the way, we received lists of medication and medical equipment that she said people needed, and just bought it at a pharmacy and took it with us to the Dead Sea. And then since then, for 8 days, we had a permanent presence at the hotel in the Dead Sea where they were staying. There was a kind of core group of volunteers who were in that work the whole time. They were treating some people with minor injuries because they'd fallen down, minor burn injuries, minor gunshot wound injuries. I think the most difficult thing that I heard of them having to do was when people were about to receive news about loved ones who had been killed, there's a need to have a doctor present on site. So our volunteers accompanied these announcements. And I think that beyond the fact that there was a need to provide direct medical support, people felt it was just so important to send this message of solidarity that a lot of the support needed was emotional. I know also that we were just in total awe of this nurse who herself had experienced such insanely traumatic events and was still focused on trying to provide care to her community. So that was what those 8 or 9 days looked like. And at the same time, we were receiving kind of small ad hoc requests from, there's a big problem in providing medication to people because they were often being housed in areas that were not very easily accessible to a pharmacy. And the Ministry of Health doesn't have a mobile pharmacy mechanism. So because we're more flexible and we're a nonprofit, we were just receiving people's prescriptions and requests and buying big bulk deliveries and then delivering them to wherever they were evacuated to. This was beyond PHRI, to other communities. We even did one delivery to Eilat.
Unbelievable, really just needing to plug so many gaps at such a time of crisis. Yeah, and from lots of thousands of kilometers away, what you say about people just rising to the moment and responding is unbelievable. We're so struck by that, and so we're so grateful for your work. Thank you. I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the other work you've been doing for Israelis who've been harmed by this attack. Have you been working at all on the hostage issue?
Yeah, I actually personally was asked to lead that response, which is very outside the normal areas of my work and responsibilities. We began very early on receiving inquiries, I guess is the best word I can use, from the family members of people who were kidnapped or were suspected of being kidnapped. There was a lot of fog around. There are some people that it's still not clear whether they died or were kidnapped. And most people who were reaching out to us were basically saying, my loved one has a health need, or I saw a video that shows that they were injured and I don't know if they're receiving the care they need. And I know that you're an organization that has contacts on the ground in Gaza. Can you please do something to help? So like so much of what was happening here, the initial official response to the kidnapped people and their families was very chaotic, and it wasn't clear who was centralizing the information. People were struggling to get in touch with the Red Cross. So we were just trying to help and offer any support that we could. I reached out in a few cases to the Red Cross to try and get confirmation that a person had been registered on their lists. We received lists of medication that people need to take regularly and then sent them to our contacts in the Gazan healthcare system. There were a few cases where there were indications that somebody's injured and in a hospital being treated in Gaza. So we tried to reach out directly to those hospitals and see if we can get any information. The flow of information was very one-directional. For many reasons, we were not able to receive response, not least because our contacts are working in the civilian healthcare system and probably had no access to information themselves. I'm sure even if they did, there was a lot of fear around communicating it outwardly, but we still felt that we had an obligation when we know that somebody is injured or in need of a certain medication, we need to communicate it. We've met with the headquarters of the families of missing and kidnapped people, and they've set up a sort of medical chapter in their work, which is incredibly well organized and has some really amazing people working in it. So we met with them about 2 or 3 weeks into the war to see if there's anything we can do to support their efforts and help them. They kind of marked a few areas where they thought we would have an added value, which was in relation to the populations that are non-Jewish that have been abducted, because they struggle to communicate with them a little bit more. There's over 20 Thai foreign workers who are held by Hamas. There's between 7 and 9 Arab Israelis who were abducted. So we've since been in contact with each of those groups to try and see if there's anything we can do to help. But it's frustrating, and it doesn't feel like there's much that any of us can do, and we're just trying to help. And there's one sentence that I always think of from one of the conversations I had, which I'll maybe finish this answer with, which is one person I spoke to whose mother was kidnapped, an elderly woman. He said, "I'm worried that what'll kill her will be the blood pressure and not Hamas." And I just keep carrying that around with me.
Thank you for that. It's harrowing. I just a reminder for anyone who's watching and hasn't yet had the chance to do so, NIF internationally is working with the victims of families hostage HQ, and we're proud to support them. So if you haven't yet seen our petition to call on the Australian government to do everything that it can to return the hostages safely, if you're watching this on our resources page, please do head to the top of the page and sign the petition. We want to do everything we can to join PHRI and our international partners in this effort to secure the safe release of these hostages. I'd love to just pick up on what you said. You were talking about support for Thai workers. What kind of work have you been doing with the Thai community inside of Israel?
So I think it's an issue that really exemplifies how there is just no end to how tragic the situation is. For people who are not familiar with this kind of reality, Israel has bilateral agreements with a few countries who are able to send foreign workers who want to come here to earn a living for a while and then go back to their home country. There's a large group of Thai workers who come to work in Israeli agriculture, and many of them worked around Gaza in the Gaza envelope communities and actually on the northern border. And Hamas didn't discriminate in its attack, and many of them were caught up in the violence too. It's still not entirely clear how many died and how many were kidnapped, because there's less of a DNA bank to use to identify remains than there is for Israelis. But there are indications that upwards of 20 were killed and upwards of 20 have been kidnapped. So in the immediate days after October 7th, they were obviously being evacuated from the south, but their evacuation looked very differently to that of Jewish Israelis. And I think it's just so heartbreaking and tragic that even in this situation, they were discriminated against. They were not taken to hotels with proper bedrooms like people from the kibbutzim and the moshavim in the Gaza envelope. They were taken to industrial hangars that don't even necessarily have a safe space for them to shelter in if there's a siren. Some of these people were injured. Some of these people saw their friends being murdered. And then it actually fell to just people with good intentions and civil society to try and help them get set up for living in these places that were not suitable human dwellings. So a group of activists came together that bought mattresses and beds and cooking equipment and food, and we connected to them and sent a volunteer doctor and a staff member to kind of visit all of the places where they were being held or housed. And we sent personal hygiene equipment. They weren't given toothbrushes and toothpaste and shampoo and whatever. So we just made a big purchase and delivered that and any medication people needed. And then it kind of, the focus shifted over time to the policy level response to these populations and what are the next steps for them? Are they going back to Thailand? Are some people staying here? If they stay here and their visa is work contingent, what does that mean? There was a lot of pressure on people who chose to stay to go back to work immediately, including, by the way, in the South. And there was kind of some actors who were trying to basically say, you can have a bed if you come back to work. And we've been looking at that and working with other partners in civil society to try and stop that from happening, to try and ensure that they receive organized rehabilitation and assistance if they need it. And there's this issue where I don't think we've had a huge role, but we have been involved in the process of identifying remains and a little bit trying to communicate with the families of hostages. So there's a group of academics who've been involved in this, and at one point it looked like all they needed us to do was pay for the delivery of DNA samples from the families of Thai workers who were missing to Israel to facilitate the analysis. Eventually, the Israeli authorities stepped in and did this instead of us. But these are the sorts of questions that we've been encountering.
Really just comes back to what you were saying earlier about trying to plug these gaps where there are no state services or the state is not acting as quickly as civil society can. Just really heartbreaking to hear, but also a reminder of how much resources are needed for organizations like PHRI. So a reminder to those who'd like to please head to nif.org.au and donate now so that we can continue to send funds to critical organizations like PHRI. Just picking up on that, you were talking about being involved in some of the policy work, the advocacy work here. I know this is not something that NIF Australia directly funds because of our tax deductibility status here, but we'd love to hear a little bit more about some of that policy work and how it's been affected by everything since October 7th.
That's a really good question, and I guess the answer is complex in that in some ways there are sudden new focus areas that we've never really looked at before as an organization, and there are other areas where we've had to kind of freeze our work because there isn't really any counterpart that's available to speak to us at the moment. So I think an interesting example that came out of the assistance to the families of hostages and missing people was that there was a lot of concern when we met with them around sort of religious pressure as they understood it to quickly bury the remains that were not identified, because there was really some remains that were very difficult to identify, and they felt that not everything had been done to ensure to give people some peace of mind as to whatever happened to their family members, and that the only considerations really should be medical and scientific. So we wrote a letter to the relevant authorities from our perspective as a medical organization, strengthening the voice of this headquarters. We've been very focused on response to agricultural Thai workers and actually other statusless communities in Israel. So asylum seekers from Eritrea and Sudan who lived in Ashdod or Ashkelon have also had to evacuate from the south, but they're not entitled to any state official services. And we've been advocating for them to receive some compensation, some coverage. They've also lost their employment. They've not been entitled to the free housing that Israelis have been entitled to. That's a new focus area in terms of policy. And then, of course, there is everything that's happening in the West Bank and Gaza, where realistically, our ability to truly impact what's unfolding is limited. But we, as we always do, are trying to shine a light on the issues that are of greatest concern. For example, targeting or secondary damage to medical teams and infrastructure in Gaza during the fighting, where internally displaced people are sheltering. We submitted a high court petition against one specific hospital's intended bombing. The hospital received a notice from the military saying, evacuate now or we'll bomb it. And we were in touch with the hospital and they told us there's X number of people hospitalized here, including premature babies, and there's 15,000 internally displaced people sheltering here. We cannot evacuate. There is nowhere for us to go. Everybody here will die if the hospital is bombed. So we petitioned the High Court against that bombing, and for now it hasn't happened. And there's a lot going on in the West Bank, which I'm sure we'll touch on too, which also requires us to be with our finger on the policy pulse.
And that hospital that was inside Gaza?
Yeah, it's the El Quds hospital inside Gaza.
Right. So does that seem to indicate that there's been some degree of success of that petition, or is it just we don't know? There has not been a bombing yet.
So I don't know. I know that we submitted the petition urgently on Friday night because that's when they received the notice. And at 3 a.m. that same night, the military updated the High Court that they did not intend to bomb the hospital for the time being. The hospital has since received another order informing it that it's going to be bombed. So everything is possible and anything is possible. And there has been a lot of damage to medical facilities. I'm sure people listening have heard some of the reports about whether there is also military activity in some of the hospitals. Our approach is that it would still be, because of the huge number of people and the fact that it is not practically possible to evacuate all of them, it would still be disproportionately damaging to innocent civilians.
Sure. Wow. I'm just looking for a small silver lining in your petition, in that it's a temporary victory, but that sounds very temporary, unfortunately. Well, let's move to the West Bank. I mean, it's clear that things are really taking a turn for the worse there as well. What are your main issues of concern when you look to the West Bank, and how is PHRI responding?
I think there are two very large issues that result in the same problem for people living in the West Bank. One is that it's basically under lockdown, and Israel has introduced an immense amount of surprise checkpoints, roadblocks, and has simply closed off all of the main roads leading between different parts of the West Bank for Palestinians. So people who live in the Nablus area in some disconnected village can't really travel to Nablus to receive treatment at a hospital if they need to. And they certainly can't travel all the way down to Ramallah or somewhere farther away. That's one major issue. And I think the more worrying issue, which I'm sure some of your followers and listeners are aware of, is this incredibly fast proliferation of settler violence, which is resulting in the fastest ever forced displacement and expulsion of communities we've ever seen. We had a designated project in a specific area of the northern West Bank looking at the impact of shepherding outposts on Palestinian communities before the war started. Two of those communities have completely left since the war started. And I think the latest report was that a total of 12 communities have been displaced. These are agricultural or Bedouin communities that are used to living off the land and have fled into towns or cities or elsewhere. And there really isn't many places for them left to go. There have been murders by settlers just last week there was a man who was harvesting his olives and was shot by an off-duty soldier who was also a settler. There was a village where 6 people were murdered in the space of 2 days, and there is just a total lack of accountability for this, which is not surprising when you consider the fact that the political actors that have a large degree of impact and responsibility for what's happening in the West Bank want to see this reality of ethnic cleansing and forced displacement. and want to see further restrictions on Palestinian movement. So these have been our areas of concern, and our ways to respond to them are, there's two. Our mobile clinic in the West Bank usually travels once a week to visit a Palestinian community. At the moment, we've decided to double that and are going twice a week, and we're targeting the communities that have been recently impacted by settler violence. So just yesterday, we were at the village where the man from last week was murdered, and heard stories from people there. The director of our mobile clinic was just sharing with me that somebody told him about a person who tried to travel for their regular dialysis treatment and were just not allowed through at the checkpoint, and were stuck there for 2.5 hours until eventually an ambulance came and gave them dialysis at the checkpoint. That's the sort of reality that they're dealing with. They can't really go to buy medication they need. They can't really travel to see a doctor. So we're trying to fill that gap as much as we can. And the second thing that we always do is trying to shine a light on that reality and to speak about it to the world and to tell those stories and hope that it reaches ears that have the ability to change it in some way. I know that the American authorities are expressing their concern about that situation, and I hope other governments intervene.
Yeah, you're quite right. Foreign Minister Wong here also raised her concern, and I think it's something that we're seeing from the international community. And indeed, it's not just PHRI, but so many of our grantees, Yesh Din and PHRI, who are sounding the alarm on this as well. So yeah, it really sounds like a 5-alarm fire there. Are you finding that your presence itself is some form of deterrent against this violence? Does it help to have the mobile clinics to stop the violence as well as to provide the direct aid?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think it may help temporarily. When we do go, it's for 8 hours. You know, it's not like it can stop. Before the war started, we were in a joint project with Yesh Din in that area I mentioned, and there I do think that having activists on the ground that are Jewish, Israeli, or international can be some degree of a deterrent, but I think there's really just an atmosphere of Wild West, and people are doing whatever they want to at the moment. So I don't think it has a long-term deterrent effect. I think it has a very important effect for the people who we visit, who feel the solidarity and feel that somebody cares about them even now when they're trapped. And that's a lot for us.
Great. Yeah, it has to be done, and thankfully is being done by so many brave people. It might sound perhaps premature, but what does the recovery effort look like? I mean, where do we go from here? Not just in the West Bank, but across all the regions that you're working?
I don't know how to answer that question. I think it's so unclear what the day after this is going to look like. We're trying to have these conversations internally and think of a strategy, but we don't know if Gaza is going to be reconquered by Israel and then handed over to the Palestinian Authority or to some international organization that will be established. Or, I mean, there's even more terrifying scenarios than that. People are in the Israeli government and public are speaking about forced expulsion of the entire population of the Strip. I don't know how much genuine intention there is behind those statements, or if they're just a desire for revenge that is being expressed by people with power. I'm not sure. So it's really impossible to say what things are going to look like. And also in the West Bank, I'm not especially optimistic about how and when this is going to end.
You talk a little bit about where things go from here and how uncertain that is, but I'd also just love to hear a little bit as one of the few nonprofits who are able to go to Gaza or had been able to go to Gaza. Can you talk a little bit about what it looked like before this? What were the circumstances you were operating under prior to October 7th?
So even before the October 7th attack, Israel had a large degree of control over what enters and exits Gaza, and that meant that the Gazan healthcare system, even before the war, was on the brink of collapse, as far as we could tell, and that a lot of basic services were not available in Gaza. For example, everything that is required for radiation therapy is deemed of dual usage potential, meaning it could be used for military or civilian needs, and therefore is not allowed into Gaza. So a person unlucky enough to have cancer in Gaza would need to apply for a permit from Israel to travel out of Gaza to receive the care they need, even if it's at a Palestinian hospital in the West Bank or East Jerusalem. And this is a project that PHRI works on during normal times, is helping people get these permits and go through this process. The care will always be inferior to if you could just access it in your community. It's broken up and there are delays and there are issues, and some people are refused permits. And there are many other examples of treatment unavailable. We'd had a project before the war to help build local capacity for kidney transplants in Gaza because there wasn't a team of trained surgeons to be able to do this, and also the lab knowledge that was required to do the testing to make sure there's a match between the donor and the patient was not available. We were beginning to do transplants in Gaza. Our volunteers were going in to do these operations and also providing training and equipment to the lab technicians. And we know that there were always huge shortages of medical equipment and medication, and we would try to purchase and deliver things as we could, as finances allowed us before the war. Now the situation is catastrophic. I start my day every day with a report from the World Health Organization and the UN Humanitarian Agency about the state of affairs in the Gazan healthcare system. The latest report mentioned that 60% of all healthcare facilities in Gaza are no longer able to operate at all. They don't have fuel, medication, basic equipment. They're not able to provide sanitary treatment to people. I just watched a harrowing interview with a MSF nurse, American nurse who left Gaza very recently and was there during the fighting, was talking about people with burn wounds and amputations who were released because the hospital couldn't continue to treat them, just fleeing for their lives with the rest of their families. Everything you can think of is in shortage. Food, drinking water. Hundreds of people are sharing a single toilet where they're being temporarily housed, and it's catastrophic, and there is really not much we can do to try to help. We're trying to coordinate a delivery of medication through the humanitarian corridor, through Rafah, through the Egyptian side. That is proving extremely complicated and difficult. We're pushing for it, and I don't know how long it'll take us to be able to do that.
I have a lot of other questions, but I think I want to let you get back to everything. Before I let you go, it's all such a terrible situation. I just want to find out how you keep going every day. What gives you the strength to keep doing this important work?
I think one really empowering thing is working at an organization where people have the ability to feel empathy for everybody who's impacted by this. There's so much discourse around us here that's one-sided, that chooses to only focus on the Hamas atrocities or only focus on what can only be described as the destruction of Gaza. And the reality is that there are innocent people on both sides who don't deserve to live this way. And I am really, truly so empowered by surrounding myself with people who agree with me. It's not at all a given here to hold that, or around the world. I see how polarized the discourse is everywhere. And on a personal level, I just think it's the basic fact that this is my home, and I don't think I could ever leave it behind and not feel that there's a huge hole in me that's pining for it and praying that it'll be fixed and better. And I feel this pain, and everybody wants to do something to try and help and counter it, whether you're focused on one side or the other or both. And the idea that there are concrete things we can do to help people is very empowering. I saw how important it was to our volunteers to go to the Dead Sea, how much people wanted to take part in that work, even though to me it was like, how can you encounter that human pain by choice? It's just beyond comprehension. I see how important it is to our volunteers to go on the mobile clinic now. And it's beautiful.
Really, really powerful. Yeah. And exactly the note I want to leave our viewers on. So thank you, Lee. We're so grateful that you're able to find the time to be on and talk with us right now. Just a quick reminder for those who are still watching to please head to nif.org.au and click the purple donate now button. Organizations like PHRI are just doing everything they can to combat these horrible atrocities, and they need all the support they can get. So thank you for all of your generosity and for making this happen. And thank you, Lee, for being on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael.
Stay safe.
It was a pleasure to be here.